Hi, welcome back. Now, many of you know I went to Nashville for the Clio conference, and it was an amazing conference, and a lot of great announcements came out of it. One of the very big things that becomes a huge resource for a lot of law firms is the Legal Trends report, because there is a wealth of data in it. So, I wanted to bring a guest back on to talk about it. So, we're going to be diving into some of the key takeaways and things that you should be paying attention to from that legal trends report and the Clio conference as a whole. So stay tuned. So without further ado, Joshua, thank you for coming back as the lawyer in residence at Clio. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate you having me back on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, how does it feel to say that, hey, another successful Clio conference has been completed?
Oh, it's such a relief, to be perfectly honest. These conferences are a year-long planning affair, and so we're already like immediately into the 2024 planning. And the same with the Legal Trends Report is it's a constant evolving set of research that we're learning from year to year and building year to year. And we made some substantial increases in terms of the data that we review and the conclusions that we're sharing this year. And it was a bit of a madhouse racing all the way to that ClioCon deadline because the curtain goes up whether we're ready or not, as Jack likes to say, our founder. So we knew that it had to be ready and it had to be the best possible version by that date. And so now that we're, oh my gosh, just 3 weeks out, I am able to breathe a little bit more, but I'm already turning my attention to 2024.
No, I guess what the plan for 2024 would be similar to this year, where you guys came out with different versions of the trends report, like one for smaller, one for medium, and then the larger report.
Absolutely. So we tend to publish our annual report in the autumn to coincide with the Clio Cloud Conference. Next year, it's going to be in October again in Austin, Texas. And if can I do a brief plug?
Yeah, go ahead.
Early bird prices are available now. So if you have any interest in going, we have a generous refund policy, and so I advise you to grab the early bird prices while you can. And that's my plug. Um,
Yeah. No, I think that's a good idea because
yeah.
I will say, like, I just went ahead and grabbed my 2 tickets while I was there at the conference because I was just
Mhm.
like, yeah, this price is really good.
Yeah, it is actually a ridiculously good price for the amount of content and the amount of networking and social events that you get. The CLE, it's kind of crazy. We don't make money on it at all, but it's such a good experience that we can't not do it. But to jump back to Legal Trends Report, so yeah, we release our main report every year in the autumn, and then we've started this new cadence of two specific reports that follow interpreting that big report data down to specific firm size. So we'll do our mid market and our solo and small firm reports. From the 2023 data coming out in 2024. Does that make sense?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yep, that make perfect sense. And it's one of those things that I think is very helpful for the industry as a whole because I hear a lot of lawyers asking those questions about how do I know if I'm on the right track or do I have some benchmarks to compare it to? So just to give people a little bit of context about like where all this data comes from, so they kind of know like, okay, all right, you know where is Clio getting all this data, or like how many different firms may be in the population or the sample size?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way that we create this report, and it's very unique, is that Clio is a cloud based set of software for law firms, which means that law firms are using their web browsers and their mobile phones to use Clio software. And why that's important is it actually shows usage statistics to Clio, like how many people are using a particular feature or different types of settings that might be preferred versus not preferred, depending on your state, for example. And we can't see the client files at all, But just from this usage data alone, we're able to actually interpret some really powerful insights into the practice of law. And the example I always use is that of the hourly billing rate. It's something that you can set as a custom rate in Clio. And then we use that to calculate like invoices as your billing. And so, from that one number, which again, I can't tell you which lawyer is using it or what cases they're using it on, I am able to tell you the average hourly rate for lawyers in North America. We're coming right up around $330 per hour. But I can also break that down a little further and tell you the average hourly rate per lawyer and non lawyer by state and by practice area. There are 40 different practice areas that we track as part of the Legal Trends report. And so, just from that usage data alone, Clio is able to start to publish insights, really deep insights into the practice of law that have never existed before. We've been doing it since 2016, and it's only getting bigger and better.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of data to take in, which I think is very helpful because there's so many people who are trying to run a law firm and they just don't have any context on whether they're doing well, whether they're not doing well. Like I had a call with another firm owner earlier today, and they just felt like they were doing really, really bad. And we talked about, hey, here's some benchmarks that I'm seeing. They're like, oh, I'm not doing as bad as I thought. Like,
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
think it's a huge help.
I think one of the things that have been really difficult for a lot of law firms to do is come up with like what is reasonable for a practice. Oftentimes, the data that existed before the Legal Trends report was surveys, mostly
Hmm.
of like partners and like these giant law firms, right? And they'll talk about how they bill like 6 hours a day, and which I wish, right? But if you're running your own law firm and you have to be the guy who orders the printer paper and does your own marketing and has to deal with billing and collections as well as being a lawyer, right? You can't always bill 6 hours a day. And in fact, our report shows that the average lawyer is really only billing between 2 or 3 hours a day. Now it's
Hmm.
improving over time, which is one of the conclusions we reached in this year's Legal Trends report. But I think this data driven approach, as opposed to these surveys that existed before, show lawyers what's actually happening and gives them some
Hmm.
realistic targets to build themselves around.
Hmm. And that's an interesting point that you bring up. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of those rates because I think some of that terminology, not
Mhm.
all lawyers are completely familiar. Like when you get into like utilization, and there's some new terminology that they got introduced to this year that I want to
Yeah.
talk about next. So can you tell us a little bit about like some of those key metrics and the terminology they're going to see when they look at the legal trends report?
Absolutely. So we have three key performance indicators, or KPIs is the acronym, that we take a look at that measures kind of your day to day performance. The first of which is utilization rate, which is out of a business day, which is normally 8 hours, how much of your day is spent on billable work. And then below that is realization rate. And that takes a look at the amount of billable work that you've accomplished in a day, how much of that actually makes it onto an invoice. And this is interesting because it's probably the one metric that's most in lawyers' control. They're able to say, okay, I've recorded 3 hours of billable work. Do I want to put all 3 hours on my invoice? And what we see is a lot of lawyers actually give themselves a haircut here. And we've done surveys as well on this because our data alone doesn't explain it. And oftentimes it's out of empathy for the client. They don't want them to get a scary bill. We're recording this on Halloween, so that's my appropriate pun. Uh, they don't want to give their clients a scary bill. And so they write themselves down. But what we see is the next level below that is our final day to day KPI, which is called collection rate. And that's of the amount of billable time that's made it onto your invoice, how much of that is actually paid by the client. And what we see when we compare these three things together is that it's kind of a lot of little cuts that end up taking a lawyer away from billable work, being a lawyer, and instead they end up with only a small portion of their day resulting in revenue. And so in 2016, when we published this, lawyers were really only billing about 2 hours a day. By the time they went through the realization haircut that they give themselves, and then another haircut from clients, they were only collecting on about 1.5 hours a day, or about
Wow.
18 to 19% of a business day was actually being spent on getting revenue.
Wow.
Whereas we jump now to our 2023 legal trends report. And these are all the exact same metrics. Some of them have increased over time pretty substantially, actually. We've seen our utilization rate jump from 28% of a day being spent on billable work to now approaching the mid 30s being spent on billable work. And while it doesn't seem like a huge improvement, it actually is dramatically increasing the revenue collected by these law firms. And so they've gone from 18% of their day being spent on revenue generating work to 28% of their day being spent on revenue generating work. And as we looked at this data over time, what we saw that actually increased the amounts billed and the amounts collected per active timekeeper in Clio by 70 to 72%
Wow.
over what our we think the baseline is in our first report. And if we actually strip out, because we really try to be like as realistic as possible,
Mhm.
we did inflation adjusted dollars, and we compensated for increased billing rates that come from inflation adjusted dollars. So if we strip those out, the amount of revenue billed and the amount of revenue collected actually increased by over 150% in the last 8 years.
Wow.
So paying attention to these metrics and improving them can make a huge impact on your law firm's bottom line. And then there's
I
the
think that's so
one
good.
more new metric that, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, I think that that is, I mean, a really good perspective because for a lot of lawyers, not really thinking about it in those contexts, like you show up, let's say if you're working 8 hours, like you said, from that utilization rate tells you how much of that 8 hours is spent on actually doing the legal work, and
Yeah.
then the realization. I think I wonder from your perspective when you tell people the difference between the utilization and the realization, are lawyers often shocked at how much they discount the work that they've been doing?
Absolutely. And we've seen like discounting, unfortunately, happens really often. And we see lawyers giving themselves like a 30% decrease
Wow.
in pay sometimes based on how they're operating. And it's just, they look at it and for some reason think that's too much. And
Mhm.
so it being the one metric that's under your control in a law firm, you should be paying attention to realization rate and getting it as close to 100% as possible. Now, there's always going to be the friends and family discount. There's always going to be the time where maybe you were kind of working two things at once, right? Like trying to get dinner on while researching at the same time. We all have those nights. So yeah, giving yourself a writing yourself down a little bit to be fair and reasonable to the client, and the reasonable fee is the standard here,
Mhm.
are can be justified, but don't let it get out of control is, I think, the takeaway here. And having this metric can show you when you're on the right path.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is extremely helpful because I always tell every client of mine or every business that I'm talking to, it's just like whatever you start measuring, you now have the ability to see what direction you're headed in. Because until you
Yeah.
start measuring it, you're just guessing. So, I mean, I think it's amazing to measure those. Now, you started to mention about the new metric that was added because the utilization, realization, collection rate are ones that people who've seen the previous trends reports are familiar with. But with the new
Mhm.
one, can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so those 3 KPIs that I mentioned before tend to kinda look at your day to day. Like, what am I getting accomplished by the end of the day? And we wanted something that was a little broader. And so we brought in this accounting concept called Lockup. And what Lockup looks at is how are your billing and collection workflows impacting the cash on hand that you have, so available capital. And interestingly, it's measured in days. So when you go through the calculations, and we walk you through how to do these in the legal trends report themselves. When you do the calculations, what you'll look at is how much of your annual revenue is trapped or locked up in either a billing workflow issue or a collection issue. And you can combine those two together to get what's called total lockup. And so, what we've done in this year's legal trends report is actually do the calculations on our database. And we now have the initial benchmarks for what is the average lockup in North America. And this is something that's never been published ever before for North American law firms. And so, what we see is that the realization lockup, that is the amount of a firm's annual revenue that is trapped is kind of like unbilled or undelivered invoice time, is around 38 days. Now,
Wow.
for firms that are in the top 25% of this, it's actually much lower. It's around 17 days, but it can actually get all the way up to like 3 months of firms just sitting on unbilled time and not putting it
Wow.
on a bill so that a client can pay it. And then
Wow.
we have collection lockup, which is now I've given a bill to a client. How much of my annual revenue is now trapped in or locked up in a client's bank account, waiting for me to get paid, right? And what we found is the median for that for Clio using law firms is 45 days. And when you
Wow.
combine those together, you get a total lockup median of around 97 days. And so this is the first year
Wow.
we've ever published this. Now, what's interesting about the kind of the breakdown here is it does give firms an idea of where to focus their intentions to improve it.
Mhm.
So, if, for example, you see you have a comparatively high realization lockup, right? Okay, the average, the median law firm is getting their bills out in 38 days, and I'm not, right? I can start improving my billing workflow, right?
Mhm.
Am I capturing my time appropriately, or am I having to spend a whole bunch of time going back and like figuring out all of my time? And so that's like pushing me back day by day. Or am I generating my bills manually, right? And each bill has to come from a spreadsheet to a Word document, and then I have to adjust them all and make it look nice. Or am I using, in our case, a tool like Clio that does the tracking and the calculation and the formatting for you? All
Mhm.
of these things can get your bills out the door faster and potentially decrease your realization lockup. And it's the flip side as well. Am I using a collections process that's locking up a bunch of my firm's revenue in a client's bank account? And one of the things we found is the thing that stretches it out the most is firms just only accepting checks. So
Really?
yeah, yeah. If you're gonna mail your bills in through the postal system, and then you have to accept checks, one, you're waiting on a client to actually have a checkbook. So oftentimes there's that delay, right? Oh, I got to go get a checkbook for my checking account. And then they're mailing it back to you, and then you have to then deposit the check and wait for the check to clear. And so what we see is firms that are using and recording like credit card payments, debit card payments, electronic check payments, online billing, have a much shorter collection lockup. And that means that that working capital, that cash that they've earned, is in their bank account and it's something that they can use, as opposed to it being locked up somewhere else and them having to rely on a different source to kind of cover the
Wow.
bills, right? So they might have to rely on like a line of credit or credit
Mhm.
cards, or maybe they're not paying themselves, right? So that they
Mhm.
can cover the expenses of their law firm. That's what lockup does, is when you lock up your firm's revenue, you make it harder to manage the month to month expenses of your law firm. So anything you can do to decrease that increases your firm's access to working capital and
Mhm.
increases the sustainability of your law firm.
Wow. So I want to take a step back and walk through a couple of practical questions as we're applying that lockup. So
Yeah.
from the realization lockup. So
Mhm.
from the studies that you're showing is that the law firms are doing the work but for whatever reason, it's taking, quite a while for them to actually bill the client for the work that they have already completed.
Yeah, so it's kind of not quite the way to think of it. That's the solution is to
Mhm,
approach how are we getting those bills out the door? But what it's really measuring is the amount of our annual revenue
mhm,
that we've earned by
mhm.
doing the work, but are not actively like billing the client for.
Wow.
And so there can be months, right, where you're getting your bills out like really quick, and there can be months when you're getting your bills out slow. And this measures kind of that year long impact
Mhm,
of
mhm.
good and bad months together. So yeah, so it's you have to wrap your head around it just a little bit that
Mhm.
it's about your working capital, like your cash in the bank.
Gotcha. Mhm,
But yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about realization, there are some really good concrete steps that law firms can take to
mhm,
the decrease their realization lockup and increase the working capital that is locked up in unbilled time.
mhm.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now on the next stage of lockup where, like I
Mhm.
said, we're looking at one of the factors you mentioned was, people, collecting payment via check.
Yeah.
As you guys kind of looked at that data, or even as you kind of talk within the company or talk to clients, were there any common roadblocks that people mention as to why they, stick with checks as opposed to moving to credit cards or even using, Clio payment or any other type of electronic payment source?
Yeah, so we actually asked both lawyers and clients
Mhm.
about why they're using the payment methods that they do. And I think it was 58% of clients actually preferred being able to pay via credit card. It was easily their preferred method. And 38% of law firms said that they are accepting like half of their bills or more are getting paid via credit card as well. So there are firms that are actually using this method and benefiting from it. What we've seen from a lot of lawyers who are telling us that are not using it is one, they're worried about turning it on, right? Which is really, you have to go through a little bit of a multi step process. And by multi step, I mean, you have to fill out a form and wait for it to be turned on, which is about one business day. And if you have all of your information ready, that's as long as it takes. And the reason it has to be done that way is this type of online money transfer does have some tax reporting. And so we have to gather the right information to make sure we give you the right tax report. And that's the tax report is called the 1099K, and it's for any type of online payments of $600 or more, which a lawyer is easily going to hit in like their first month. Some
Yeah.
states are higher, but we just give everybody a 1099K so they can quickly and easily do their taxes.
Mhm.
So part of it is they don't give themselves the time to turn it on. And then the last one, and this one's really interesting to me, is they think it's going to be too expensive to use online payment methods. And that actually then brings me to another section of this year's legal trends report that we took a look at. And that was of the many different billing and collection features that Clio has built in the last number of years, are those creating a positive impact on the law firms that use them? And what we found is that firms that are using, and in the report, we looked at 11 different features that relate to billing or collections. And what we found for all of them, except for one, that all of them increased both the realization rate, the amount of hours that we're making it onto a bill, and the collection rate, the amount of money that clients were paying rather than not paying. And so using these online payments and credit card payments and payments via the Clio for Clients mobile app, all of them actually increased a firm's realization rate and collection rate. There was one exception, and that one exception was payment plans. And this one's
Gotcha.
really interesting from like a data perspective, um, because what we realized is we were asking the wrong question there. So when you create a payment plan in Clio, it allows you to automate an installment payment, right? And you can break it down however you want. It can be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, and then you can control the amount as well. And then it just automatically bills that for you. Um, but because it starts with an invoice, what that means is that invoice doesn't close until the payment plan is complete. And so it looks like your firm is not collecting on invoices, even though you are collecting money that whole time. So then when we looked at it in terms of our firms that are using payment plans benefiting from using this feature, what we found is that use of payment plans correlated with an average increase of 49% in monthly revenue per lawyer per month. For
Okay.
solo law firms, it was actually closer to 70% increase in monthly revenue was what the average
Wow.
lawyer was seeing when they were using this feature. And so, yeah, your collection rate was 2% lower is what
Mhm.
the collection rate looked like. But the money collected was like thousands of dollars higher per month.
Wow. And
Yeah,
that
which
makes a huge difference for a firm. I mean, because I think often talk to a lot of firms that when payday comes around and it's time to pay the staff, they see this really big dip in their bank account to where it's like if you have a lot of, I mean, if your lockup is really high, it's just
yeah,
like finding solutions to that could avoid you having that stomach ache around payday.
we did some hypothetical examples in the legal trends report. And for example, a firm that has $500,000 in annual revenue, if they can decrease their lockup by 10 days, that actually frees up $16,000 in working capital throughout the year.
Wow.
And so that's $16,000 you don't have to borrow from the bank or put on a credit card or put off making a
Mhm.
purchase that you need for your law firm because you'll have that cash available. And so 10 days doesn't seem like a big deal when it comes to an
Mhm.
improvement. But one thing we noted was people who are allowing their clients to pay via the Clio for Clients app. That was the improvement in lockup. It was a 10-day improvement. And
Wow.
so would you make it faster and easier for your clients to pay you and increase your firm's working capital and increase your firm's realization rate and increase your firm's collection rate? It was
Mhm.
really, it seems like a no-brainer, but we now have the data to back up why you need to make these choices and why um, just doing kind of the bare minimum when it
Mhm.
comes to running your law firms, when using your law firm software, might actually be doing yourself a disservice. You can make things
Gotcha.
easier, you know?
Mhm. And I think that's a really good point because I think there's so many lawyers who are running a law practice and, those type of things like managing working capital, like those are the nuts and bolts of running a business that aren't really taught in law school. And
Oh, yeah.
I don't think a lot of people have before have had the right tools in their hands to understand, hey, why this matters or why we need to make this small tweak and this behavior because hey, it's going to have a big impact. So I hope a lot of people are able to get a lot of value over understanding the concept of lockup and the
Mhm.
corrective action. Now, in the legal trends report, is there a section in there that talks about like, hey, based on these things that we found in the trends, here are some recommendations or some things to keep in mind? Like, will people find that in the legal trends report?
Absolutely. And so the 11 features that I talked about, there are 11 features that are available to everybody in Clio. And so they can just go and take a look at the relative impact of each of those to what they correlated to and find the ones that work for them. If I had to pick some of my favorites right off the bat, email bill sharing is quite frankly this is going to sound negative. It's a no-brainer. Like if you have a tool that will generate and send your bills via email and include a payment link in those emails, the improvement to your firm's bottom line is startling, to be perfectly honest. It reduces lockup, especially your collection lockup. It actually increases your realization rate. We found that law firms that are using email bill sharing actually have an 18-point increase in their realization rate. And so that means that they're just giving themselves that much less of a haircut, basically. And so they're sending more build time to their clients. And then what's really interesting is their collection rate on these emailed shared bills is increasing as well. So their clients are getting a bigger bill, but even then they're paying more, a bigger percentage of that bigger bill than law firms that aren't using that email sharing. And so giving yourself that haircut and making yourself wait for things like receiving a check is actually just dragging your law firm backwards from where it could be. And so it's an ease of use from the feature, both for the lawyer and the client, and a huge increase in both client experience and law firm financial well-being. So we go through again 11 of those. Some of the ones that stood out to me were email bill sharing. Actually, payment via the mobile app was surprisingly high as well. And another one that I think made a huge difference to law firms were automated bill reminders. So if a client forgets to pay a bill, right, an automated bill reminder will go out and send them a link where they can just click here to pay now. That one has actually generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for law firms over the
Wow.
last year. Yeah, without a law firm having to pick up the phone and like chase a client down. And then another one that was especially impactful for larger law firms was the outstanding balance feature. And this one is it's half report, half billing, where it will tell you which clients have outstanding bills, what those bills are, and then what the total is for that. And then from there, you can actually send them a reminder for the total of those invoices. And especially for larger law firms, this made a huge impact in collection
Mhm.
rates. And so rather than just leaving that money on the table, billed but outstanding, there are some really simple steps that law firms can take, like sharing via email or turning on the automated bill reminder feature. It's not even something you have to like do on a frequent basis. It just does it for you. And then the outstanding balance feature, especially if you're like a bookkeeper or at a larger law firm, will very quickly make a difference for you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that automated reminder is a huge one. It's something I definitely highly recommend for people because sometimes sometimes the invoice gets lost and they just need a reminder. And if it
Yeah.
doesn't pop up, then you could be sitting around waiting for them to pay, and it's like they just needed a simple reminder. So I think that is amazing.
Yeah, and
Now,
the law firm can forget as well, right? You're busy working on cases, and so you may just not have time to chase down every outstanding bill. And so, what we've seen is that technology that does that for you can do so in a very positive way.
awesome.
Mhm.
Now, I know that it's Halloween and you got to get the kids out there because they're probably itching to go out there and get this
Yeah.
candy. A couple of final questions.
Mhm.
With so much that went into the legal trends report, and I know you guys are already starting to work on the next one.
Mhm.
Will there be like any more webinars or content that you guys are putting out where you're talking about some of the things that you found in the legal trends report that you just released?
Absolutely. So one, we have a recorded webinar available right now where if you go to clio.com/LTR, you can see the report. You can read it online. You can download your own copy. You can watch a webinar where I explain a lot of the concepts that we've talked about and more because we have barely scratched the surface of what's included in there. Some of the things that you'll see are what we have recorded for Clio payments and how it actually cuts the waiting time to get paid in half. We've done a survey with lawyers and clients on how they expect the kind of the massive adoption of artificial intelligence to impact the practice of law and where they want to see it impact the practice of law. And there's a whole bunch more in there, including breakdowns of hourly rates per state, per practice area, and more. Gosh, it actually boggles my mind sometimes. But yes, clio.com/LTR. And in addition to that, we also have our benchmark rate calculator where you can enter your own practice area and rate and see how you compare against your state's averages. So, are you a premium feature? Make sure you're charging premium rates. And here's one place where you can go and check it. And then we also have a state by state breakdown of the average hourly rate per practice area. all on this area. So there's a ton of information that lawyers can go and find online.
Nice. I love it. Well, one final question. I mean, I think as you guys are starting to work on the 2024, are there any areas that after reading the legal trends report that you just put out, is there
Mhm.
any particular area that you personally are interested in diving more into as you guys are starting to work on the legal trends report for the upcoming year?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because there's always things that big questions that we just don't have time to answer, right? As we race towards the CleoCon release date, there's always more. So one of the things I want to do a much deeper dive in is how are law firms using flat fees, and can we really see what is the difference in law firm performance when they use flat fees in addition to or in as a replacement for hourly billing. And that's when it's going to be tricky because there are a lot of ways to record flat fees in Clio. And so there's a lot of different data that we're going to have to try and access and organize and interpret. But I think we're up for the challenge. If any team can do it, it's my team. Mm,
Awesome. I love it. Well, I will say
mm,
for everyone that's listening, that is definitely a hot topic because a lot of firms are exploring the idea of flat fees. Some have sworn by, hey, we only do flat fees. Some have been nervous about it. Some say, hey, we only do hourly billing. So it will be interesting to see what data we can find there. So, Joshua,
mm.
thank you so much for coming back on the show to give us a recap and also just to talk about some of the great work that you have going on. We'll be definitely sure to include the links so people can get their copy of the trends report and to check out the webinars and the resources that Clio is offering. So thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you, Terrell. And I really appreciate the hard work that you do interpreting this to a particular law firm. Like I can throw out some big numbers and benchmarks, but when you work with a law firm and help them apply those benchmarks to their particular practice, that's such a huge wealth of value. And so thank you for doing that.
Well, absolutely my pleasure. And everyone, thanks for tuning in.